Thanks everyone online and in the room for joining us for the March 2DCC webinar. Our speaker today is Professor Cosmi Lin from the Department of Material Science and Engineering at Texas A&M University. And Cosmi, you are good to go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. It's my great honor to give this seminar to the world's best expertise working on 2D materials. So I'm going to talk about my vision or my perspective about how the challenges or our solutions for the engineering the 2D materials with a high precision and how we can take advantage of those for future ultra-scaled electronics. So I guess most people in this room has seen a lot of similar figures like this. So right now, this silicon technology has a lot of development, especially in terms of different architecture. And for this 2D material family, because they are just atomically thin materials less than 1 nanometer, with that extreme body thickness, people, especially industry people, have demonstrated this gate-all-around or nanosheet transistor structures, and people are trying hard to continue this scaling and push the limit for the individual device performance. At the same time, also because of this 2D nature, we can very easily delaminate this material from gross substrate and transfer them on top of each other. And many people have demonstrated using this 2D material system for back end of line integration, so people can monolithically integrate different technologies, different functionalities on top of each other, especially with the silicon, so we can implement the functionality silicon cannot achieve, and the entire microsystem is more powerful and more efficient. This is a figure I stole from the Stanford group. So this is a very nice future invention of the future microelectronics. So we can stack different functional systems made with different materials within the same chip on top of each other. And then we can use this 3D heterogeneous integration to stack different chips on top of each other or on side by side using this highly integrated interposer. But if you look at this future nano systems, it's a very complicated system. And also, we may want each layer to be very well controlled, hopefully to the atomic scale. So there are some challenges of this precision engineering for future nano system, nano electronics. The first one is related to how we characterize the materials or devices. So it's a metrology challenge. So the first point is there's a very huge length scale gap. We want to produce everything in this 300 millimeter wafer scale, but at the same time, we want to make sure each die is perfect, each device is perfect, and each interface is perfect. And so we need to also categorize them, figure out the properties of those interfaces at the limit of 1 nanometer to 10 nanometer scale across the entire 300 millimeter wafer. So there's a huge dimensionality gap, even to understand the system, not to mention to categorize everything. And for the, also people are stacking different chips, different subsystems on top of each other. So there's a further complexity on the third dimension, both within one chip or across different chips. So for the metrology challenge, the first one is we need to develop metrology that must span wafer scale coverage or high throughput, but we need to provide nanometer to atomic scale resolution. The second challenge is ideally, we want to image or characterize each interfaces within this complicated structure. So we really need to disentangle the feature we care about, the material property, from all the complicated environment. That's about the metrology part. For the precision engineering, another perspective is how we can really develop chemical processes to control the structure and the property of those interfaces with atomic resolution. And there has been some challenges in the microchip technology, and people also envision some of the 2D material may be a good candidate to address those challenges. I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is about this ultra-scaled gate-all-around transistor, and as I mentioned earlier, because they are ultra thin, and it's a natural two-dimensional crystal. So the surface are atomically smooth, no dangling bonds. So when we scale down the thickness of the silicon transistor to below 1 nanometer, there's a benefit in terms of mobility. If we compare it to conventional 3D bulk semiconductor, the mobility would degrade very significantly at that extreme thickness. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges, material or interface related challenges in order to really realize those ultra-scaled transistor with 2D materials. For example, how to reduce the contact resistance, how we can design efficient and reliable contact and spacer region doping within the material, and how we can engineer, develop ultra-thin high-K dielectrics as the insulating layer, and engineer the interface to reduce the interface traps. And finally, we also need to develop high-quality, low defect density synthesis of this material at the wafer scale. So any of these challenges happens at those atomic interface. We really need to address those challenges with high precision. Another example are the higher layers. So on the silicon wafer, only the bottom layer, or the layer on the surface of silicon, are silicon transistors. If you look at the cross-section, all these layers are metals. These are metal connections or interconnects to connect that 1 billion transistor on chip. And there are like tens or even 100 different metal layers. But for the very bottom layer, because the transistor dimension has been scaled down to super small, maybe 10 nanometer footprint, the interconnect has to be on a similar scale or even smaller. But when people are trying to scale down the copper-based interconnect to below 10 nanometer scale, the resistivity increased very significantly. This is a resistivity, not a resistance. But even for resistivity, there's a huge degradation. It's related to surface scattering, that rough surface. Also, grain boundary scattering at this 10 nanometer scale. Copper is a polycrystalline with very small grains. So electron going through the grain boundary may scatter and lose energy. And then another degradation factor is that additional layer that's wrapped around the copper. People call it a liner and a diffusion barrier. We need that for the reliability purpose. We need to avoid the copper from delaminating. We also need to avoid the copper atom from diffusing into the dielectrics, so that will cause failure. So right now we are at the 10 nanometer scale. We really need to design the interface and rethink about different metal or how we can grow this metal so they can still be single crystal or larger grain size. And we need a thinner liner or diffusion barrier to keep this scaling. So in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about these two aspects in the context of 2D materials. The first one is a precision metrology for 2D materials. So I'm going to cover two subtopics. The first one is AI-enabled high-throughput in operando spectral microscopy. So this is more focused on dealing with the high-throughput wafer scale characterization and also dealing with categorizing the material in a complex environment. But it may not be sufficient. We really need to figure out individual defects and what's their impact on the device performance. So I'm going to talk about our development of using conductive AFM for high precision defect categorization. For the second part, I'm going to talk about this two technology, logic, transistor, and interconnect technology, and how 2D material is helpful and what are the remaining challenges there for those precision interface engineering using 2D materials. So let's start the first part. We want to develop this optical spectral microscopy system for high throughput. Just a very simple example. So whenever you are working on 2D material, especially devices, especially earlier days, you have to use this mechanical exfoliation and try to exfoliate those randomly distributed flake on top of a silicon wafer. And then you need to sit in front of optical microscope for hours trying to identify the good flake with a large enough area, good shape, and the targeted thickness, so you can stack them on top of each other and make heterostructure and the devices. In the past few years, there has been a great development across the world to automate those 2D device fabrication. So this is one example, the Q Press from Brookhaven National Lab. So they integrated automated exfoliator, cataloger, library, stacker, categorization, all in a controlled glove box environment. Everything is protected by argon and everything is automatic. So that saved the researcher a lot of time and greatly accelerate the scientific discovery. If you look at which part is the most tedious, time-consuming, I would say, to find these flakes. So we have some, just to give you example. So if you are if you are very experienced researcher, you may be able to use your human eye to identify the thickness for a given material, for a very well-designed substrate, etc. But there may be a challenge problem if we don't know which material it is. Just by looking at the microscopic image, you may not be able to tell just by looking at the optical contrast. So here is statistics. So different color means different materials in the RGB space. You can see there's a significant overlap of different material if we just use the RGB, the optical contrast information. But if you think about the entire process, we do exfoliation, mechanical exfoliation. So for the optical information, so far people only use the contrast, but for the edges, there may be some subtle feature we can use, especially for the shape of those flakes. They are very related to the mechanical property because of the exfoliation. So if we have automated exfoliation, those processes are actually perfectly controlled. Then those shape and those scattered information, the thickness, etc., those shape information are very correlated with the mechanical property like crystal symmetry, mechanical anisotropy, and exfoliation energy. So those information are embedded in the shape and flake size information in those graphical features. So we developed this UNET-based neural network, so we can take advantage of both the optical and the mechanical property and features. So we can train just one network, which is able to detect 13 materials in our database. Here are the lists. And also we use some example to demonstrate that it can detect both what material it is and the thickness for each material. So for the network, we just input this optical microscopic image. It can give you this label map for different type and also the thickness of the material. So that's basically automate that flake hunting process. But but we can even go beyond that. After we train this neural network, we can use the information extracted by the neural network. As I mentioned, the optical graphical information include deep, subtle information about optical and mechanical properties. So we can further construct the material property predictor based on this trained neural network. Just to give you a very simple example of how we can do this. So this matrix is called confusion matrix. Let's look at the first half first. So the diagonal one means how many percentage of flakes are being detected correctly. Those are different labels or different material thicknesses. All the off-diagonal terms are the mistakes made by this neural network. We also feed additional material we didn't use during the training, so we can extend this matrix. So for those all the mistakes the model is making, that's actually related to the similarity between the two materials. So here are all the materials and their properties. Let me highlight some of them. So for this square, they are all those TMD 2H phase semiconductor materials. And in the prediction set, we use another material. So you can see they have this similarity. Another example, so for this blue one, so in the training set, we have HBN, that's a wide bandgap, very wide bandgap insulator or semiconductor. And in the new materials, we also have a few which have also very wide bandgap. So they also see the confusion or similarity. Another example are this 1T, T prime, or TD. So we also see those similarity. So based on that, we can actually just project this matrix by each column, but we group the column by the similarity or by the property of the materials. One network is not enough. To increase the accuracy, we independently train 16 different neural networks, and they will vote which one is which. So based on that, we can develop this material property predictor. It's a statistical prediction, so the height of the bar gave you the confidence. So this is one example about the band gap. If we group those columns differently, we can construct another predictor. This is about the crystal structure. So we can see a lot of good prediction for the unknown materials, but some of them may still give you a wrong prediction because they may be these two materials may be similar in some other aspects. This is just to give you an idea. This is a starting point. If we are more careful with how to design this predictor, this material predictor can be much more helpful. So that's about the optical microscopy. Let's look at the spectroscopy side. So if we have a thin film, like a thin film of 2D material, any other materials, in order to figure out the optical property, the complex refractive index, people usually use this ellipsometer. That's the setup. So the incident light is with a large angle, and we need to collect the reflected light with the same angle. This system, I would say, is very convenient, but not powerful enough. The first challenge is it requires intensive model fitting. You need to have some prior knowledge about the material to be detected. And if the substrate is more complicated, it's going to be impossible to fit the data to the model to get the extraction. So if we have unknown and complicated underlying substrate, you put a film on top, it's going to be impossible to use ellipsometry to figure out the refractive index. For the third challenge, the setup itself is very complicated with a high angle incident and the reflection. Everything has to be well calibrated. And also, we may not be able to get a smaller scale a mapping of those complex refractive index easily. So everybody may be more familiar with this benchtop optical microscope. So we only use a vertical incident light and only collect the reflected light. We can also still get a spectrum, but traditionally, this information is not enough to extract the N and K, the real part and the imaginary part of the refractive index. We want to still explore if this is still possible. So instead of varying the angle in our input, maybe it's easier to show in the next slide. So in the input, we put 2D materials on different substrates. Those substrates are just multi-layer dielectrics. Those are just random number we deposited or tried. So the network itself doesn't know, but it gives you the complexity or the tuning knob. And then we collect maybe 5 different reflectance spectrum for the same material on different substrate. And we use that as the input. And then we train the network for the output. It is able to predict the N and the K of this material. After the training, we tested the system with our experimental data, so we can also see some level of prediction, but there's still some difference. So the dashed line is the prediction, the solid line is the ground truth. So we verified, so using the reflectometry, but we need to provide slightly more information. And using the neural network, we were able to still reconstruct the N and K information, but this system may not look that useful. If we think about the problem, so this is a modified version. So in a lot of applications, the materials we are interested in are in a complicated device structure, and they may be evolving. So the material optical property may change with the temperature, and the substrate temperature may change. And it may respond to magnetic field or mechanical strain or even electrical signal. So the N and K may evolve gradually within the same material and in a complex substrate. If we can capture that evolving of N and K in real time, this system will be very useful to do the in-operando categorization of the thin film materials, evolving materials. So now we are dealing with this 4-dimensional data. For each image, we have X, Y location and a wavelength lambda, and this image cube is evolving with time by a certain external excitations. So in order to deal with this data set, we designed this reflecto, this RNN-based neural network. So it includes some autoencoder to deal with the refractive index and the reflectance spectrum. And we use a reference refractive index, like for example, the starting point of the refractive index of this material as the input. And then we input the series of this reflectance we measured during the changing of the external excitation. And the prediction is how this N and K evolve with those excitations. So this network was trained with a lot of optimization just to show you the results. So we verified that this prediction works well for simple and complicated substrate. So we use this single dielectric layer to demonstrate the simple substrate. So the left-hand side are the reflectance measured. We vary the temperature with the system, and the MOS2 N and K also change. So we use this as the input of network, and we can predict how the N and K evolve with temperature for the same material. We also demonstrated a similar stuff for multiple layers. For a particular case, we just have a 2-layer aluminum oxide and silicon oxide. For a very complicated structure, we fabricated this diffracted Bragg reflector. That's a interleaved layer of titanium oxide and silicon oxide. There are maybe 5 pairs of these 2 layers, and this is a measured reflectance, and these are the extracted N and K based on our model. So all of these are the prediction from a single neural network. We didn't train a neural network specifically for one application. So this is a very good accuracy. Just to give you an idea about the statistical behavior, so we use these 2 criteria to evaluate the accuracy. The first one is called the Pearson correlation coefficient. The second one is called the relative accuracy score. So ideally, we want it to be 1 or 100%. As you can see for the 3 structures as listed here, they all give you very high score. So for this one, is very close to 1. If you look at the lower bound, it's 0.98. But this score, the medium is about 96, 97%. They are very good results. The dots here are the results I just shown here. So you can see how good the prediction is. Okay, so now we deal with optical microscopy and we deal with the spectroscopy. Now we are thinking about how to combine this so we can really deal with this 4D data set. So another aspect is to collect this data, it takes super long time. Even to collect this data cube, it's going to be minutes. If the material is evolving quickly with time, this hyperspectral imaging may not work. It may not respond to this fast change of the material. So in order to accelerate this data collection, we may not need to exhaust the entire space. We may just sample a few points in this 3D data cube and then evolve with time. We may still be able to reconstruct the entire 4D data set. In order to do that, we can use the Bayesian optimization. This is simulated results just to give you the rough idea. For simplicity, we just simulate a 2D data set. The x-axis represents the spectrum, y-axis represents the location. This is our ground truth, the true value of the spectrum. And using Bayesian optimization, we can let the model decide which window we should collect in this spatial and spectral domain, the spatial and the spatial hyperspectral space. And then we can, so after the first round, we collect some data, and then we feed that data to the model. The model will decide what's the next window to collect the data. So this different plot means when we have a 2 window, 5 window, 10 window, etc. So the 30th window only cover half of the entire area. It's already a perfect match, but we can even go lower. For example, with the 20 windows, we can capture more or less all the features in the space and in the spectrum. So this is just a simulation to demonstrate this idea. Right now, we are working on demonstrating this experimentally. So this is an overview of the system we are working on. So we use this benchtop optical microscope, but we need to also have a careful selection of the light source and the spectral graph. And then using that RNN-based neural network, we can collect the spectrum and how they evolve with time quickly. And then we can further, so from here, we can already get the permittivity or refractive index. And based on that data, we can also train a physical property predictor. For example, we are interested in a specific optical feature. We know it's related to, for example, defect states or mobility or something, or optical emission. Then we can just train a predictor to compress this data so it's a faster feedback loop. So that can already give us physical property prediction. But at the same time, we would like to feed this data back to the Bayesian optimization to actively control this spectral microscopy. So based on its physical property of interest, and we will try to figure out for the next acquisition where we should go in terms of the space, spectrum, accuracy, spectral resolution, etc., in order to explore the unexplored space or maximum the physical property of interest. So we can actively control the stage and the spectral graph. So the entire system can run much faster and hopefully in real time. So we can capture that evolving material property. So this is a still ongoing research. Okay, so that's about how to accelerate and how to make the categorization system more general. For the next one, we are going to talk about the high precision, especially to categorize defects in 2D materials. So defects or impurity scattering is a very significant factor that limits the mobility or the electrical performance of 2D semiconductors. The left-hand side is a theoretical study. So it's around room temperature. So when the impurity density or defect density is from 10 to the 11 to 10 to the 13, you can see a great degradation of the mobility. This is the experimental results. The axis is a little weird, but it's essentially the same thing. Mobility versus defect density. The left-hand side is higher defect density, and we see a great degradation of the mobility. So there are many ongoing research to correlate defect density and mobility. For mobility, we need to measure devices like micrometer devices, or we need to measure a lot of them on a wafer scale to get the statistics. For characterizing the defects, we really need to have a more direct and a higher throughput approach, so we can scan those high precision mapping and try to figure out the defects. But if it's fast enough, we can sample more area on the wafer, so we can establish better understanding and correlation. So the particular approach we are focusing on is called conductive AFM microscopy, or CAFM. It's very similar to AFM, but we use a conductive tip, and we scan along the material, and we measure the outer plane conductivity, so we can get this kind of mapping. So this is from a recent study. The first column are the conductive AFM results. So all those features correspond to a point defect in TMDs. The right-hand side are the correlated measurement with a scanning tunneling microscopy. So you can see very clear one-to-one mapping. Even those slight features, those tiny features, can also give you kind of a correlation. But conductive AFM is more accessible. The instrument itself is cheaper and is relatively faster as compared to other approach. So here is a rough comparison I came up with. So we compare this scanning transmission electron microscope, STM, conductive AFM, and the Raman spectroscopy. So for those electron microscope, that's also a commonly used method. The major drawback, it can give you a true atomic resolution. The major drawback is the sample preparation is a little tricky, and the data throughput also slow, and there may be E-beam damage. So whenever we image the atomic structure, keep in mind the electron beam may have changed something. So we needed to develop a lot of analysis, data extrapolation to accommodate for that. For the STM, the main difficulty are the sample preparation and the less availability for the systems. Conductive AFM has a good enough spatial resolution. It can be 0.1 nanometer to 1 nanometer scale. For the depth sensitivity, it can be sensitive to bilayer of our sample around the 1 nanometer. Sample preparation difficulty is moderate, and we can install it in ambient or in a glove box if your material is air sensitive. Data throughput is also moderate, not as fast as Raman, but faster than the other two. It may also provide additional information about the local density of states. That means density of states versus the Fermi energy. So STM can give you the direct results from STS measurement, but from bias dependence, we are currently developing this. We hope to also get some information about the density of states of those individual features. And another comparison is about the defect detection limit. For the first three, they can detect a wider range, especially if the defect density is very low. For the last one, Raman is an optical approach, and it detects phonon scattering. If the defect density is low, the defect-related Raman band will be too weak, so it can only be good to detect material with higher defect density. So the sample preparation is not that straightforward. We struggle a lot with the cleanliness of the sample, but eventually we can demonstrate this good imaging for different samples. CVD sample, this is a CVD monolayer MOS2. We can also exfoliate monolayer from a crystal grown by chemical vapor transport. And we also demonstrated exfoliated sample from the two-zone self-flux method. So these are the images. All the point features correspond to a single point defects. And you also see they behave differently. So the most straightforward information is we just count how many defects are there and divide by the area. We can estimate the defect density. We can compare that with other approach. So for the same sample or the sample produced by the same method, we compare the STEM, conductive AFM, and the Raman spectroscopy. For Raman, we use this side band of the E prime peak in MOS2 to figure out the defect density. So as you can see, it's already very weak. This is a relatively good quality sample. And we compare the defect density extracted by these three methods shown in this plot, especially here. If you look at the x-axis, they match with each other very well. For the last one, there's another point for the STEM results. The defect density is slightly higher than the Raman and conductive AFM results. That may be because of some kind of defect generation because of the E-beam irradiation. Another approach is a low temperature PL. We have a defect-related peak. So we can qualitatively figure out how good quality the sample is. For people interested in quantum meter of electronic applications, this is also more relevant. To look at some details, so there are two types of defects, charge defect and isovalent defects. For charge defect, these are charged. So there are Coulomb interactions, Coulomb potential. So that will give you band bending. So when you measure the outer plane conductivity, the shape, the apparent shape is larger. But if the defect is a charge neutral isovalent, they only give you around 1 nanometer feature. Here is a systematic STM study to show you this trend. And here are the summary. So for the isovalent defects, there are usually small defects in STM or conductive AFM. This should be 1 nanometer. And for charged defects, there are large defects, about 5 to 10 nanometer. And here listed the typical isovalence defects and the charge defects. There are more information. We can do bias dependence. So here are some mapping examples. We use this triangle shape to anchor, try to align different frames. So it's the same region, but with a slight drift under different bias. You can clearly see those defect features emerge and they behave differently at different biases. We did some careful analysis. So the x-axis is a conduction along the pristine region is equivalent to the bias. and we use the current difference we measured on the defect size versus pristine to categorize what's the intensity of those defect feature in the conductive AFM. You can see very complicated mapping, and they are related to different defects, different spatial locations on the sample. My students were working hard to align those frames so we can plot the behavior for individual defects. And right now, this is still ongoing. We can roughly classify different defects into 4 types. They have a different bias-dependent behavior. And later, we are working, currently we're working on correlating those IV response with the density states for different defects. Then we can figure out the atomic structure of each of them. Okay, so for the rest of the time, I'm going to quickly go through some interface engineering method development we have. The first one is about transistors. So a huge challenge in 2D transistor are those contact resistance. So this is some early study that summarize contact resistance versus thickness. They are all very high, not good enough for real applications. And if you think about this problem fundamentally, in the ideal case, if only charge transfer happens at the metal semiconductor interface, there's a Schottky barrier. The barrier height is determined by the work function difference between the metal and the semiconductor. If you draw this trend, barrier height versus work function difference, it should follow a line with a slope of 1. But in reality, there are hybridization of the electronic states. As a result, within the band gap, there are additional states generated. We call it metal-induced gap states or mix. So when we put these two materials in contact, electron has to fill those mix. If we have enough electron, it may go to the conduction band. But in most of the cases, we don't have enough electron. Then the Fermi level will be pinned in the middle of the band gap. When we consider that for all different materials, semiconductor materials, this relationship, this modulation is much weaker. The slope is much, much smaller than 1. So in order to deal with that, we developed this semi-metal contact. We replace the metal with a semi-metal like a bismuth, antimony, etc. They have a lower density states in a certain energy range. If they have good some good alignment with the band edge, so that metal-induced gap states from those energy range is also much smaller, then we may have enough electron to fill all the states. Then the Fermi level can be pushed to the conduction band edge. So we explore this bismuth from theoretical calculation. We indeed see this mixed states within the band gap. They are super weak. And we also fabricated devices to demonstrate with the bismuth contact, the device performance can be much better. And we use this TLM measurement to extract the contact resistance. It's about 130 ohm micrometer. That was the best at that time. For later study, also with semi-metal, other group has a break this record. So this is a more recent benchmark in our review article. This reviews different types of TMD, N-type contact. The left-hand figure is a monolayer, right-hand figure are few layers. So for all the good candidates, they are all semi-metal. But if we look at the P-type side, people just started to explore, but they are still far away from this N-type side. So we also tried to use this theoretical approach to computationally screen which high work function semi-metal may be suitable to access the valence band for a good P-type semi-metal contacts. And we focus on this 2 material, tantalum phosphide, cobalt-tin sulfide. They have a different surface termination, so the work function are also different, but we focus on the higher termination. And from the DFT calculation, we can see the metal-induced gap states is indeed suppressed. And if we plot the work function versus the barrier height versus the work function difference. The red one is the simulated p-type semi-metal. So they are more or less the same slope of the ideal one, the slope of 1. So that means the Fermi level opinion is indeed suppressed. We also have some systematic comparison in the literature about the contact length. The length of the metal contact also needs to be greatly reduced. Here are some summary. So all the reddish ones are the semi-metal contacts. So they can also give you good scaling capabilities. Based on that, we can anticipate the on current versus different channel length, but the contact length should be scaled simultaneously. For bismuth, we still see this plateau that's a saturation velocity limited. For all other metals, they are contact length limited. I'm going to skip this. So the lines are predictions, but if we put our device results on the same figure, there's a discrepancy. So that's because there's another limiting factor. So it's basically self-heating. So this is the ideal IV curve for a transistor from a compact model. So we have a linear regime and a velocity saturation regime for the ID-VD curve. But if we look at our experiment, there is a saturation, but the shape are different. Especially for this case, there's a negative differential resistance. So those are the typical features for the self-heating effect. When we drive a large current across the material, the middle of the channel is heated significantly. That gives you a degradation of the mobility and the velocity saturation. That gives you this drop of the current. We develop a compact model incorporating the Drew heating effect, self-heating effect, and we fit the compact model to this data. They agree reasonably well. But based on that, we can have further analysis. These are two different backgate dielectrics or monolayer MOS2 with different channel length. We plot the temperature rise and the effective thermal resistivity for these two data. And we can see a boundary around 100 nanometer. They have opposite trend for the temperature rise. Basically, for higher channel length, the heat dissipation is dominated by the autoplane dissipation. But when the channel length is smaller, the lateral dissipation through the MOS2 into the contact becomes to be helpful. So that can actually make the temperature increase smaller. So that's why we see this non-monotonic trend. Based on that, we can update our projected curve. So we can see in the intermediate gate length, about 100 nanometer, the self-heating is the most significant. But when we further reduce the gate length, it may be okay. But if you really want to solve this issue, everything also happens at the interface, especially between the 2D material and the dielectrics. So this is from another review article about thermal boundary conductance between 2D material and different substrate. So those are still too low, so the heat dissipation autoplane is still not ideal, so we should still work on it. Another thing related to the dielectric is the charge the trap states. So if we look at this transfer characteristics in log scale, before the device turn on, we want this slope to be as sharp as possible. We call it SS. Ideally, SS should be 60 millivolt per decade. For all non-ideal cases, that makes this bigger. So theoretically, we can see some benefit if we compare silicon and the monolayer MOS2. The SS can be suppressed at a lower gate length, but all these points are the experimental data, so we are still far away. The limiting factors are actually the dangling bonds and the non-ideal interface. That gave us a lot of trap states that will make this slope less sharp. So this is another challenge we need to deal with. For the last topic, it's about interconnect. So we are using 2D material as the interfacial layer. So previously, people has demonstrated that a very efficient ultra-thin diffusion barrier that will prevent the copper from diffusing across the boundary into the dielectric layers. Our focus is to use the same structure, but we can use the 2D material as a template to guide the metal growth. And so we can understand this system by this Gibbs free energy. So there are terms related to surface or interface energy, strain energy, grain boundary energy, if they are grain boundary, and also defect energy. So with 2D materials, we can engineer this interfacial energy. And if there are good lattice match, we can also mitigate the strain energy. And if we consider when the crystals are aligned, we started with nucleating and depositing individual domains. And when they start to merge, we also need to consider grain boundary. And if the domains are more or less aligned, the grain boundary energy can also be reduced. So based on this understanding, we designed this experiment. So based on TM grid system, we deposit a different metal on a holy carbon film, or we transfer MOS2 on this silicon nitride TM grid and then deposit the metal. And then we use TM to characterize the microstructure of the deposited thin film. So these are all 10 nanometer films, copper, ruthenium, and gold. Without MOS2, we see smaller grain size. With MOS2 underneath, we see increased grain size. Here are the statistics. So for each metal, we see a significant increase of the grain size. That's encouraging. We also use the diffraction or FFT to figure out the alignment between different metal grains. And we categorize on different images to get the statistics. So so for copper, the dominating facets is a 111. They more or less align with the MOS2 crystal. For ruthenium, the distribution is wider, but we also see a alignment trend. For gold, it's the best. It can align very well with the MOS2. So here are the statistics, so we can see the alignment. Without MOS2, the grains are randomly oriented. Yeah, so now we no longer need to deal with the large angle grain boundaries. Only small angle grain boundary. The barrier across the boundary is lower, so the electron may transport more efficiently. So in the future, we are going to explore the transport of this aligned grain metals as well. So that concludes my talk. So we talk about some examples about using AI to accelerate the metrology and to make those optical metrology generalized to complicated substrates. We also discussed how we can use conductive AFM to figure out the defects and the different types of defects. And for the later part, we talk about our interface-related development for the 2D transistors and how we can use 2D materials to guide the growth of metal nanowires for future ultrascaled interconnect technology. Finally, I'd like to thank my group members, especially Farhan and Xunqian Di. They contributed to what I talked about today. They are leading this, and also my collaborators and the sponsors. These works are mainly sponsored by NASA and NSF. Thank you.
Thanks, Cosmi. Are there any questions online or in the room?
I guess I can start off asking a question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that talk. Lots of really good information that I know a lot of people are probably very interested in who are attending this webinar. So yeah, the use of the ReflectoNet for deep learning analysis of the 2D stacks that you have, that's really fascinating. So an issue that we have, so we have in situ spectroscopic ellipsometry on our MOCVD system,
Yeah.
and we have films where there's sort of like lateral heterogeneity, right? So we may have some regions that are bilayer, some that are monolayer. Um, and that's a complicated system to analyze. I'm just curious whether you think like using neural networks and deep learning would be a useful approach to try to accelerate analysis of those types of, I mean, I don't know how much you have done in terms of looking at like 2D layers that have different thicknesses and things like that within a given sample.
Yeah. So for the reflectometry, we can focus the beam very well, so we can do a 2D mapping and give you the thickness information and K for different thickness. For the ellipsometer, I guess one beam still cover a relatively large region. So there's an
Yeah,
averaging effect of a monolayer, bilayer, etc. So what we measure is the average signal. But if we have a good definition about the system, like we take that averaging effect into consideration, we generate a data set to capture those effects, and then we train a neural network. It may be possible we can get more information.
okay,
Instead
okay.
of having the average, the N and K, we may be able to give you other information like a percentage or
Right, right.
layer by layer particle or something.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
we can
but
kind
we
of look at
haven't.
how the sample is evolving in time during growth. It's just that, yeah, we are limited to one single spot on the sample. So,
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's also a good point. Yeah, that in operando one is exactly for that purpose.
right, right,
Care
yeah.
about evolving of the sample. This is
Yeah,
the
to look at
purpose.
an evolving surface. So, yeah, I'll probably follow up with you with some more questions
Yeah,
offline.
yeah. So this is in collaboration with Shang-Chi. So we
Oh,
can
yeah, yeah,
discuss together.
yeah.
Awesome. Are there any other questions?
I could ask a question.
Go for it.
Hi. Thank you for the nice presentation. We published several papers on epitaxy of different metals on the 2D semiconductors just a few years ago. I was curious how you envisioned the whole interconnect structure with the metals and dielectrics actually being fabricated. I mean, it might not be a Damascene kind of process. Um, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so what we are trying to see use those planar deposition approach, beam evaporation. We deposit those on 2D materials at a room temperature. If the sample is super clean, we can observe that template effect. For the Damascene process, it has two components. The first one is the seed layer, the sputtering, or the sputtering is more challenging to deal with. So actually, the ruthenium one in our study was done by sputtering. This ruthenium one.
Mm-hmm.
That's also why the results is not as good as the other one. We create a lot of defects on the 2D material.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We
but
also
there is still
compared
some room to
evaporating and
optimize that.
buttering.
Yeah. Once we have that templated seeding, then for the electroplating, I still need to learn. So maybe that can give us some benefit. If we do the electroplating on the already almost single crystal metal, maybe the electro deposited film can also be templated by that.
Okay. But you haven't thought through or worked out yet how you would make the whole interconnect structure.
Oh, right, for the
Yeah.
trenches, right? Yeah,
Right,
right
right.
now we just use
That
a
was one
planar
thing that was
structure.
always puzzling me after we achieved the epitaxy and recognized this opportunity was how to move forward with the complete
Yeah,
interconnect structure. So I was really curious what
yeah.
thinking you had on that.
Yeah, so I saw on the literature somebody has tried to low temperature CVD or MOCVD It's like below 400 degrees Celsius. And they can be grown on a trench structure conformally.
Okay.
At a 2D layer, and then we can do the deposition, guided deposition of the metal. That's one possibility. Also, actually, in our NSF Fuse team, we have Zhihong Chen from Purdue University. She worked together with a few companies. They developed this plasma enhanced approach. So they start with a tantalum thin film. Tantalum is already used in the interconnects, and they sulfurize it into tantalum sulfide at a low temperature using PECVD. That's also a very good diffusion barrier. So she only focused on diffusion barrier at that time. Right now, we're also exploring if tantalum sulfide also works for the templating effect.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Cosmi, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.